5 paint colors to pair with Sherwin-Williams Repose Gray. If you want to know more about Repose Gray itself, I strongly suggest you watch our review on it first in the description down below or on the cards up top. Let's get right into the first color pairing, which is the white color pairing. I think it's always important to have a white color to go with any color because it's just so useful to have, whether you're painting your baseboards, your ceilings, or even other walls in some cases. The Sherwin-Williams white that I chose here is called white sand, which is kind of descriptive, but also not. When I think of white sand, I think of sand that is obviously light, but also maybe has a bit of beige with a bit of a peachy color from seashells and whatnot. I love the beach. Sherwin-Williams white sand has a tiny bit of that, but it also seems to feel a tad gray leaning combined with a touch of yellow. It was part of the Warm and Welcoming color collection by Sherwin-Williams, but not necessarily because it's an overly warm white. I think in certain cases, it could have a touch of a green undertone that can show up depending on the color surroundings, but it's extremely subtle and does not show up very often for what it's worth. Especially when you park it next to Repose Gray, which for a gray does have some of that green happening in the background. So any green that you might see in white sand will really just melt away. That's why I think these two go together, because that green undertone will feel a bit softer for both colors and they'll just feel more neutralized next to one another. So a perfect implementation of these two is to have Repose Gray as your wall color and white sand as your corresponding trim color. After our white color, next we have a light color, which could also be classified as an off-white. Egret White has noticeably more depth than white sand, and that's because it just has more saturation and actual colorant inside it. It also feels less greeny than Repose Gray, especially because of its added bit of red and brown within it. You could classify it as a grayish, which is just a combination of gray and beige, but I almost prefer to define it as a taupey beige. In other words, it's a light beige toned with some gray and brown to give it an earthy quality. And this color specifically complements Repose Gray because of its distinct undertone difference. I really notice the difference between these two colors when they're next to one another compared to white sand and Repose Gray, which do coordinate a bit more cleanly. Next to Repose Gray, Egret White does feel a little more airy and warm, but it still remains grounded and earthy rather than an overly light cream color, for example. They both live within that neutral color palette, which is why they pair so well, even though they present pretty distinct looks overall. A very simple use case for these two colors is to have Egret White in the kitchen on the walls and Repose Gray in the adjacent family room, where they're still taking up the same visual space, but not necessarily in the same room. It's a great way to section off individual spaces within your home too, especially if your house is a little more open concept, and it really adds visual dimension that some houses really could use. So we got a white, a light. Next is our medium color, which is Eventide. This darker mid-tone color reintroduces that bit of green we talked about earlier, but it's also flooded, quite literally, with blue as well. Man, I'm so funny. Next to colors like off-white and beige, Eventide has quite a bit more noticeable saturation, but it's still not an overly vibrant color on its own. It's shaded with a bit of black and gray to keep it just a bit muted and how I like to describe it as being dusty. When we start to use colors that are a bit darker, like Eventide, versatility comes into question a little bit. It's just a bit harder to justify using this color in an entire home or even in larger areas like a front foyer and hallways. Deeper, darker colors are a bit easier to use in smaller doses, whether it's maybe a single room or even in accent situations like feature walls or feature rooms. I could easily see Eventide being great in bedrooms and bathrooms, mainly because I'm just biased towards cooler colors in those spaces. Or you can even use it as an accent off of the walls in an otherwise Repose Gray room by utilizing it on your pillows, your curtains, area rugs, all that. Do not paint your area rugs. Just feel like I should say that. Color number 4 is the dark color pairing, which is Storm Warning. So a little bit of a watery theme we're continuing from the last one. Although Storm Warning doesn't really have much blue to speak of. I like to classify it as a deep, dark taupe that combines black, brown, and a little bit of green. It has quite a few similarities to Repose Gray in regards to its undertones, but due to its insanely dark coloration chin, it's obviously going to have a ton of contrast visually. Even though Repose Gray had that little bit of green in its undertones, I think that Storm Warning's green undertone is a little more prominently on display here. But even still, they're pretty adjacent undertone-wise and really belong in the same family of colors. A really straightforward implementation of Storm Warning in this palette is to have it as an accent or a feature wall in a Repose Gray room. You can definitely use this color on the wall behind a bed's headboard and then have Repose Gray on the 3 other walls to draw the eye towards that piece of furniture. And do not think that I was going to leave you all with just a bunch of relatively neutral paint colors in this palette. My favorite color in this series is the 5th and final color. We started with white, we shifted to light, we had a medium, we had a dark. All that's left is our daring color, which is sort of the wild card choice. I went with Berry Cream, which is a slightly frosty purple midtone that brings just that pop of color saturation that this palette needed. Purple is an excellent pairing option to anything green related, and we know that green has been sort of creeping in the background in a lot of these colors. But what's nice is purple is also close enough to the blue in Eventide to allow it to coexist pretty nicely. Definitely a polarizing choice, but don't think of it as something you want to use all over the house. It's just that extra little touch of color that you can implement to add some fun. Here's some more information on Repose Gray if you want to take a deeper dive on that color specifically. This one was fun.